The old house stood on a hill overlooking the town of Havenwood, a place as unremarkable as its name. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the seasons blurred into an endless loop of muted colors and predictable routines. I had moved there seeking solace, a break from the cacophony of the city, but what I found was something far more unsettling. It started subtly, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a momentary feeling of déjà vu so intense it left me breathless. A black cat walking past my window suddenly appearing 2 houses down, the exact same cat, the same collar, the same lazy gait. I dismissed it as stress, exhaustion, the overactive imagination of a writer left alone for too long. Then came the newspaper. Every morning, the Havenwood Gazette landed on my porch with a dull thud. One particular Tuesday, I noticed an article about a local bakery winning an award. I remembered reading it the day before. I shrugged it off. For an error, I muttered, tossing the paper aside. The next day, the same article, same page, same photograph. My unease began to simmer. The glitches escalated, conversations repeated verbatim. The radio played the same song twice in a row, then again later that evening. A flock of birds flew past my window in perfect formation, an unnatural symmetry that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to rationalize it, sought explanations in sleep deprivation and faulty memory, but deep down, a cold dread was taking root. I confided in Sarah, the owner of the local bookstore, a woman with wise eyes and an even wiser understanding of the human psyche. Havenwood's always been a bit different, she said, sipping her tea. Some say it's a place where the veil between worlds is thin. Worlds, I scoffed, forcing a laugh. You mean like ghosts? Sarah smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. Maybe, or maybe something else, something we don't understand. Her words did little to comfort me. That night I lay awake, the silence of the house amplifying my fear. A rhythmic dripping sound echoed from the bathroom. I got up, expecting a leaky faucet, but the taps were dry. The dripping persisted, a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to burrow into my skull. I traced the sound to the mirror. As I stared into my reflection, the dripping intensified, the glass fogging with condensation, and then I saw it. Behind me in the reflection, the hallway stretched into an infinite loop, doors repeating, wallpaper patterns blurring, the very fabric of the house unraveling into a twisted Escher painting. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the hallway was normal, mundane, utterly unremarkable. I stared back at the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The infinite hallway was still there, mocking me with its impossible geometry. Panic seized me. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and smashed the mirror, shattering the illusion, but the dripping continued, now louder, closer, as if the very walls were weeping. I fled the house, driving aimlessly through the empty streets of Havenwood. The glitch is now a constant barrage on my senses. Every streetlight I passed flickered in the same pattern. Every house displayed the same window arrangement. Every parked car was the same make, model, and color. It was as if the town was a poorly rendered video game, a world built on repetition and illusion. I ended up at the only place that seemed remotely normal, Sarah's bookstore. She was there, sitting behind the counter, a book in her hand. "I see you've noticed," she said calmly, as if I'd simply commented on the weather. "What is happening?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What's wrong with Havenwood?" "It's not Havenwood," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's the world. It's breaking, glitching. We're living in a simulation and something's gone wrong." I stared at her dumbfounded. "A simulation? You're serious?" "Think about it," she said, leaning forward. "The déjà vu, the repeating patterns, the feeling that something isn't quite right. It's all evidence. The code is unraveling." "But why here?" I asked. "Why Havenwood?" "Perhaps," she said, "Havenwood is the control point, the place where the simulation is most vulnerable. Or perhaps it's just random chance." Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the bookstore into darkness. A low hum filled the air, growing louder, more intense. I covered my ears, my head throbbing with pain. Sarah remained calm, her eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the flickering streetlights. It was me, but not me. This version was distorted, fragmented, as if rendered from incomplete data. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. "He's a patch," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum, "sent to fix the glitch. But his methods aren't always pleasant." The distorted version of myself raised a hand and a wave of nausea washed over me. The bookstore began to dissolve around us, the shelves warping, the books turning to dust. The air crackled with energy, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my house, lying in bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. The Havenwood Gazette lay on my porch. I picked it up, dreading what I might find. The front page featured a story about a local dog winning a prize at the county fair. I had never seen the article before. The day seemed normal, the town unremarkable. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress? I went to the bathroom and stared into the mirror. My reflection stared back unchanged. No infinite hallway, no dripping walls. Just me, a writer haunted by a nightmare. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a fleeting image of a black cat walking past my window. The same cat, the same collar, the same lazy gait. And for a moment, I saw it again, the flicker, the glitch, the subtle hint that the world around me was not what it seemed. I knew then that the nightmare was not over. It was only a pause, a brief respite before the code began to unravel once more. And I was trapped in Havenwood, a prisoner in a world on the verge of collapse, waiting for the next glitch in the Matrix. The old lighthouse stood sentinel on the jagged cliffs of Precipice Island, its beam a lonely finger tracing patterns in the perpetual fog. I was there to study seabird migration, a solitary observer drawn to the island's stark beauty and isolation. But Precipice Island held a secret, a chilling anomaly that defied explanation. It began with the gulls. They were everywhere, their cries a constant grating symphony. At first I dismissed it as typical behavior, but soon I noticed something unsettling. They were always in the same positions, perched on the same rocks, their white bodies stark against the gray stone. And they never moved, not even when I approached. I documented it in my journal, attributing it to some strange localized phenomenon. But then the fog changed. It wasn't the usual swirling mist. It was wrong. A flat, opaque sheet that hung motionless, defying the wind. It tasted metallic, like licking a battery. One evening as I made my rounds, I noticed a change in the lighthouse itself. The paint was peeling in unnatural patterns, revealing layers of colors that seemed to shift and writhe beneath the surface. The beam, usually a steady pulse, flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the fog-shrouded cliffs. I went inside hoping to find a rational explanation, but the interior was even more unsettling. The spiral staircase seemed to stretch on forever, the steps uneven and strangely angled. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. And then I heard it, a low, guttural moan echoing from the top of the tower. I climbed, driven by a morbid curiosity that overrode my fear. The moan grew louder with each step, a sound of unimaginable suffering. When I reached the lantern room, I found the source. It was the keeper, old Silas, who had warned me to stay away from the lighthouse at night. He was strapped to the central mechanism, his eyes wide with terror, his skin stretched taut over his bones. But it wasn't Silas. Not anymore. His body was contorting in unnatural ways, limbs bending at impossible angles, his face a grotesque mask of pain. His mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of jagged, mismatched teeth that didn't belong there. And then he spoke, his voice a distorted echo of Silas's familiar drawl. "It's all." Repeating, he croaked, his body spasming. "We're trapped. In the loop." I stumbled back, horrified, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't madness, this was something far more terrifying. The world was breaking, the fabric of reality tearing apart. I fled the lighthouse, scrambling down the treacherous cliffs, desperate to escape the island's suffocating grip. The gulls watched me, their unblinking eyes following my every move, their silence more menacing than any scream. Back at my cabin, I barricaded the door, clutching a rusty axe I'd found in the shed. The fog pressed against the windows, its metallic taste growing stronger. The lighthouse beam pulsed erratically, painting the cabin walls with grotesque shifting shadows. I huddled in the corner, listening to the wind howl outside, but it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of the code unraveling, the sound of the simulation collapsing. Suddenly, the door splintered open and the distorted version of Silas stood before me, his body still flickering, his eyes burning with unnatural light. "You can't escape," he rasped, his voice a chorus of distorted whispers. "We're all trapped." He lunged at me, his contorted limbs reaching for my throat. I swung the axe, burying it deep in his chest. But he didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He simply stared at me, his eyes filled with a chilling emptiness. "It doesn't matter," he said, his body dissolving into a cloud of static. "You're already part of the glitch." And then everything went dark. I woke up on the beach, the cold sand beneath my cheek. The sun was shining, the fog was gone, and the gulls were circling overhead, their cries sounding almost normal. I stood up, brushing the sand from my clothes, trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked down at my hands. They were flickering just for a moment, a brief distortion like a faulty image on a screen. I ran back to the cabin, desperate for answers. Everything seemed normal, mundane. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something on the table, my journal. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The pages were filled with my meticulous observations of the seabird migration. But there was something else, scrawled in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. It's all repeating. I slammed the journal shut, the truth crashing down on me with the force of a tidal wave. I wasn't escaping the loop. I was part of it. I was trapped on Precipice Island, destined to relive the nightmare forever. I ran outside, screaming, desperate to break free. But the island held me fast, its jagged cliffs rising like prison walls, the gulls circling overhead, their silent judgment a constant reminder of my fate. And then, I saw it. In the distance, a boat was approaching the island, carrying a new observer, a new victim, a fresh face to witness the horrors of the glitch. I smiled, a chilling, vacant smile. It was time to start the loop again. After all, misery loves company, and on Precipice Island, misery was the only constant. The fluorescent lights of the subway station flickered, each pulse a stab at the decaying reality I'd grown accustomed to. A symphony of mechanical groans and the distant screech of metal against metal was all that resonated through the grimy, tiled expanse. It was late, or perhaps early. Time had begun to lose its meaning, becoming as malleable and unreliable as everything else in the city. The air was thick with the stench of stale urine and despair, a familiar cocktail that stung my nostrils with every breath. I was alone, save for the shadows that danced menacingly in the periphery. They writhed and twisted like tortured souls, their shapes mimicking the decay that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Each passing second was a hammer blow, driving me deeper into the abyss of existential dread. I clutched the worn strap of my bag, its contents my only solace, a tattered copy of 1984 and a half empty bottle of cheap whiskey. Then it happened. Across the tracks, a figure materialized. It was a woman standing unnaturally still, bathed in the sickly glow of the flickering lights. She was dressed in a crisp business suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, a stark contrast to the grime and decay surrounding her. But it wasn't her appearance that sent a shiver down my spine. It was her eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with an unholy terror. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something that no human was meant to witness, something that had shattered the fragile illusion of reality. She opened her mouth, and a voice devoid of all emotion echoed through the station. "He is coming. He sees you." The words were simple, yet they struck me with the force of a physical blow. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trap bird. Who was he? What did she mean? And why was she looking directly at me? Before I could speak, the woman's body began to convulse. Her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her face contorted into a grotesque mask of agony. The humming grew louder, reaching a fever pitch. Cracks appeared in the tiled walls around her, spiderwebbing across the surface like fissures in a crumbling dam. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the stench of ozone filled my lungs. Then, with a final, agonizing scream, she shattered. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Her body exploded into a million fragments, each one dissolving into shimmering pixels before disappearing into the nothingness. I stood there, frozen in terror, as the echoes of her scream faded into the oppressive silence. The cracks in the walls remained, a permanent testament to the horror I had just witnessed. My mind struggled to comprehend what had happened, to reconcile it with the mundane reality I thought I knew. But I knew deep down that reality was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep us docile and compliant. And now, the cracks were beginning to show. Driven by a desperate need to understand, I staggered over to the spot where the woman had stood. The air still crackled with residual energy, and the smell of ozone lingered in the air. As I peered closer, I noticed something glinting on the ground. It was a piece of paper, pristine and untouched by the grime of the subway. I picked it up, my hands trembling. On it was a single word written in an elegant script: awake. A wave of nausea washed over me. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that the word was meant for me, that I was not meant to be a passive observer, trapped in this decaying illusion. I was meant to fight. But against what and how? As I pondered these questions, the subway tunnel behind me began to darken. The shadows stretched and writhed, coalescing into a single amorphous mass. A pair of crimson eyes opened within the darkness, burning with an ancient and malevolent intelligence. "He is here," a voice whispered, a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of my soul. I turned and ran, the abyss itself nipping at my heels. The subway station became a labyrinth of endless tunnels and decaying platforms, each one a mirror reflecting my own fear and despair. The shadows pursued me relentlessly, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I knew that I couldn't outrun him forever. He was everywhere, in the flickering lights, in the crumbling walls, in the very air I breathed. He was the architect of this nightmare, the master of this illusion. But as I ran, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I may be trapped in his game, but I would not play by his rules. I would fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything. I stopped running, turning to face the darkness that pursued me. "I am awake," I shouted, my voice trembling but resolute, "and I will not be controlled." The crimson eyes narrowed and the shadows surged forward, engulfing me in their icy embrace. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the end. But the end never came. Instead, I felt a jolt, a sickening lurch that tore me from my body. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a sterile white room. Machines hummed softly around me, and tubes snaked from my body, feeding me with some unknown substance. A figure stood before me, a man in a white coat, his face obscured by shadow. "Subject is experiencing cognitive dissonance," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Initiate recalibration." And then everything went black. I awoke back in the subway station, the flickering lights still casting their eerie glow. The cracks in the walls were gone and the air was clear. The woman, the paper, the shadows all gone. Was it all a dream? A hallucination brought on by too much whiskey and too little sleep? I didn't know, but as I walked out of the subway station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That the world around me was not quite as it seemed. And somewhere deep down a voice whispered, "He is watching."